Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? So we're working on our third installment of the great jazz labels as they arrived on the scene chronologically to a degree. And there's some overlap here in terms of what these labels have done and how they've arrived. But we're trying to show you their debuts and their arrivals. And this puts us into 1953 after the first two episodes covered the 40s and the early 50s. And there is an incredible amount of jazz labels on the scene in this time frame. It's like a pretty prolific slice of the music industry still to this point. Jazz sales are definitely in decline in these post-war years. Jazz is definitely marginalizing and becoming a peripheral sound. We're talking 1953, 54, 55 today, so we're still well away from the real surge of the rock and roll, rhythm and blues, but it's starting to take shape. The jump blues kind of dominated the race charts in the 40s, early 50s. The Boneless Jacksons, the Louis Jordans, those guys have been really changing the demographic. Labels like King have been around doing some of that stuff. A lot of southern labels, all small labels. So the jump blues has definitely changed the direction of what the African American was consuming in terms of buying music. White America was still behind the times in terms of following black culture like they always are. And jazz was still selling pretty well in the college circuits and circles. And it wasn't clear, I think, to anybody whether or not jazz was going to be forever marginalized or whether it had another heyday left in it. And it's still enough a part of the jazz landscape in the mid-50s where it was still deemed a very important part of any record label's resume. And as I've said many times, jazz at this point is driving the arrival of graphic design in the music industry in terms of album art. Throughout the 78 RPM era, we were looking at paper sleeves with the label logo on them, and there was no real graphic covers in that era. Some of the books that started showing up in the late 40s would have some kind of a cover on them. And again, Norman Granz and the Clef family was kind of at the forefront of that with David Stone Martin. And by the time we get into the early to mid 50s, Burt Goldblatt's revolutionizing graphic design in jazz. We've seen it at Roost, we've seen it at Discovery. We're going to see a couple other labels today. We see it at Storyville. We're going to see a couple other labels today where Goldblatt has a really large imprint and helps change graphic design. We saw the arrival of Cool, the West Coast sound, in the last episode. We talked about how the birth of the Cool on the West Coast really starts to change the landscape, the instrumentation. In some ways it divides the jazz camps to a degree. It's not to say there wasn't some really hot cooking stuff going on the West Coast, down on Central Avenue in Los Angeles, but the white musicians were definitely cooking up the Jerry Mulligan, the Chet Baker Cool. And that stuff was really starting to have an impact nationally, sales-wise. It was one of the great last movements in jazz that was quite accessible and commercial and sold pretty well. It probably doesn't have the success of the Benny Goodman years in terms of sales, where the millions of 78s were being sold, even during the Depression. The Glenn Miller stuff of the late 40s on the 78 RPMs, that stuff sold really well. We kind of forget how well some of that stuff sold and how popular jazz was. But there was certainly a real resurgence in white America with the popularity of the new cool sound that was happening in jazz, the Brubeck thing going on out of San Francisco. And Norman Granz was kind of conscious of that. So he launches a second imprint called Norgran, Norman Granz, Norgran. And we talked about Clef in episode 1, which has its roots in the late 40s, mid to late 40s, 46, 47. And he decides to launch a second imprint called Norgran. And he wants to kind of put his more cool artists on this imprint. And it's certainly not cleanly defined in posterity when you look back and go, yeah, this is cool, this was not cool, clef. I mean, there's a lot of interchange. You see artists on both imprints for Norman. So it's not this clearly defined different sound by any means. It's not like you'd be able to put on a Norgran record or a clef record and blindfold someone and be like, oh yeah, that's Norgran, that's clef. It's very synonymous largely. But the idea was to have a cooler impression and hoping that it would help launch the sales of some of these artists. And some of these artists definitely are cooler than others. So we're going to look at Norgran here first. This is Norgran number 1, Johnny Hodges. And again, thinking of Hodges as a cool artist, it's a bit of a misnomer. He, of course, played with Ellington for decades. One of the great innovators on the alto saxophone. Everything that Parker was in terms of ferocity and fire and dynamic and ability, Hodges was the cool, creamy. He really brings melody to the fore in the alto saxophone, which can be an acidic, brittle instrument in the wrong hands. Hodges is just the essence, a lot like Paul Desmond, really, with Brubeck. And so maybe that's where the cool crossover. Norman's like, well, if people love Paul Desmond so much and Brubeck, this is Paul Desmond's impressionist. This is where Desmond's getting his sound from. It was actually a pretty tough piece to come by. It took me a while to track this one down. Hodges was a character, a wonderful, wonderful player that every jazz fan should have pieces by. And his soloing in the Ellington groups over the years is just seminal stuff. And he definitely was one of the real luminaries of the alto saxophone, the Ellington Orchestra, and then one of the real prized pieces of the Norman Grand labels for a good 10 years. Now here we have Stan Getz and Dizzy Gillespie. And what you have represented there is two of the cutting edge artists. Getz, of course, coming from the cool camp, but Getz also played bebop. And Dizzy Gillespie, of course, was one of the architects of bebop, but they are in a rather more cool setting. And you actually hear Dizzy playing with some wonderful tonality here, expressing incredible balladry. Dizzy was a full rounded player. He could play any style with clarity and bombacity, integrity. One of the true architects of the trumpet. Buddy DeFranco was a clarinetist. Cool cover here by David Stone Martin. You can see the band of color on the side, which kind of is a forebear somewhat to what Reed Miles was going to do later at Blue Note. And I almost feel like this was David Stone Martin seeing some of the work that Burt Goldblatt was doing. DeFranco was a great clarinetist, and his work does tend to lend towards cool post-bop modernity, but he's not schlocky he's a real wonderful player, full of melody. I think he's a Philadelphia native, if I recall, Italian and Philadelphian. The great Al Hibbler, and this, of course, will be coupled together with his other 10-inch onto one of the early Verve 4000 labels, and Al Hibbler sings with a different cover. But this is the original version of this. And Hibbler, again, is an Ellington alumnus, one of the great singers of the Ellington band in the 40s. Norman sweeps him up, and he gets a couple sessions here, singing some standards. Hibbler's got a wonderful baritone voice. I'm getting sentimental as time goes by. Hibbler's a great, great singer. A real worthwhile piece to track down. Now we have Lester Young. And Lester, as we've seen, was well represented in the Clef series earlier. And here he's playing with the Oscar Peterson Trio. And so, again, labeling this as cool jazz, it's a bit of a misnomer, but Lester Young is in a lot of ways one of the great influences of the cool. His sound and tonality, his laissez-faire approach, his kind of lazy behind the beat, swanky. I mean, in some ways, he is cool before cool was a thing. You hear that, Gray Boy? And he nicknamed everybody. I mean, Lester was such a personality, such a character. Great cover. They used that cover in several different color variations over the course of. There's number 6, same cover with the red background. And again, this is Oscar Peterson Trio. I think this is in the early days when it was Barney Kessel and Ray Brown with them. And that trio was one of the true backbones of a lot of Norman Grand's catalog. Louis Bellson now, one of the great drummers of the swing era, plays with Basie. I think he played with Ellington for a while. I think he did battles with Buddy Rich at times. Fantastic drummer, one of the originators of the double bass drum set that we saw guys like Keith Moon and the heavy metal guys all use. Bellson was one of the originators of that. Bellson was a dynamic, fiery, furious player. And I know he led his own band for quite a while. He's probably channeling some Krupa, and you got Don Elliott in there on the mellophone. Elliott's a very varied player with a lot of different instrumentation. Bob Patterson, Joe Puma's on the guitar, who I love. Bellson, Ralph Martin on the piano. So interesting. Shades of cool, shades of the swing era. Charlie Ventura, one of the great tenor players of this era. Again, I think a Philadelphia native, if memory serves. Ventura is a fantastic player. And he has some of the harder edge bop in him, but he's also definitely got some cool in him. But he's a East Coast swinger. So it's really hard to really pinpoint and narrow this Norgran stuff as being super different from the Clef stuff. This is Chico O'Farrell, who you'll see an Impulse later, and I think he's a Verve a little bit. But this is an early Chico O'Farrell. And again, Norman Granz is one of the real bringers of the Afro-Cuban thing. And I was listening recently to the Dizzy Gillespie record that he does early on with Chana Pozo and got Night in Tunisia on it and Con Alma, a lot of those standards. And boy, that's an incredible record. Oh, one of the most underappreciated records in the jazz canon, if you ask me. It's such an interesting melange of two different genres and styles that become a furious template that was very popular for a while, very danceable, very ethnic and cultured and urban. It's a fantastic sound. But here you have Chico O'Farrell. What a cool cover. This is not David Stelmartin. It's Hubley, who does a number of covers in jazz as well. But again, it's a cool, probably a little bit of influence from David Stelmartin on that. Great stuff. Chico's around for a long time, leading groups and bands. Then you have the urbane Mr. Carter, and that's the great Benny Carter. Carter's just a fantastic trumpeter / alto saxophonist, led big bands, and was a strong composer. Was a huge face in the scene throughout the 30s, 40s, and 50s into the 60s. He doesn't get the credit that he deserves today. Sadly, he's probably less well-renowned than the aforementioned Johnny Hodges, which is, I mean, Carter's a huge figure and a huge impact player, and one of the great composers and arrangers, and he was just super in demand. And I think partly in the LP area, he becomes more of a background composer arranger guy. But here's the French piano player Bernard Pfeffer, fantastic player, a little rigid in terms of his swing. It's a little rigid, but the inimitable Don Bias. And Bias was in France at this point. Essay Rhythm, Don Bias. So that's why it's probably the French. And I'm guessing this was probably licensed from a French recording, my guess. I don't think Bias was in America in the early 50s at all. Slim Gaillard, who I'm a huge fan of, He kind of innovates the Voight sound. It's fun, it's tongue-in-cheek, it's got some jump blues, some gospel in it, it's got a lot of fun lyrical energy. It's really cheeky stuff. And then Slim Geyer works with the bass player Slam Stewart. So you have Slim and Slam together for a while, which was a fun duo. But Slim Geyer is an incredible character who, again, is very forgotten in today's jazz landscape. My friend Jean-Michel told me they were on a jazz cruise in the Mediterranean, probably back in the 80s. And they were off the coast of Cap d'Antibes or somewhere over there. And they saw a naked man swimming on the beaches while they were docked at shore. And everyone's like, who's that man? What's he doing? And it turns out it was the great Slim Geyer out there having himself a little dip and a little refresher. So there's Louis Bellson again with his second piece. There's that drum set I was telling you about. So this Norgran stuff is really important stuff. Here's Hibbler's second work for Norman Granz. Again, lovely DSM cover. Next we got more Buddy DeFranco. Again, another wonderful cover from David Stone Martin. Just kind of really tells a story, if you ask me. Some of those characters and pictures he's doing. There's Gizzy Gillespie and Stan Getz Part 2. And almost all of this stuff was coupled onto LPs later on. The great Tal Farlow shows up here. And whether this is cool or not, again, it's jazz guitar trios, combos are almost always got some cool in them. The guitar lends itself to being cool, especially that clean guitar jazz tonality. Great cover. Again, the color banding that I think Goldblatt's responsible for. But you see Reed Miles as well, kind of being inspired by more Charlie Ventura. And so, as I've said before, it's really not debatable how important Clef and Norgran was to jazz, as jazz was reassembling and reshuffling itself post-war, and bebop was alive but not really marketable or being recorded proficiently. The cool was kind of advancing and developing. Hard bop had yet to really come on the scene. The big bands were in disarray. The finances of the industry were very much up in the air. What was going to happen with jazz? And it's really Norman Granz and these two labels that solidifies the careers of a lot of these men, gives them work, including Ella Fitzgerald, including Billie Holiday, including Charlie Parker, including Lester Young. This body of work that, this is the great Benny Carter, Volume 2, the formidable. One of these is far better than the other, the Benny Carter. The one has strings on it, which is good, but the other one's a lot more swinging. Toshiko Akiyoshi, the great Japanese piano player, she was discovered when the Jazz Philharmonic was in Japan. And I think, if I remember, Ray Brown might have been one of the guys who really brought her to Norman's attention. Talk about a tough 10-inch to come by. Great DSM cover. Great Bud Powell. And there's Bud Powell, probably 53, 54. Cool cover. I think this is that Hubley guy again, who does the graphic design here. But again, it's definitely a forebear to what Reed Miles was going to come to do graphic design-wise. George Wallington Trio, the fantastic Italian native who kind of reinvents himself in America. The Six, which was a cool kind of post-bop group. Fantastic players. A record you can find for not too much money because it's pretty forgotten people. Tommy Goodman, Bob Wilbur, Eddie Fife, Porky Cohen. But it's really swinging stuff. I mean, there was a lot of great bands out there that are totally forgotten. Buddy Rich, the fantastic drummer who backbones a lot of the Verve sessions from these eras. I mean, even the great drummers of that era, Buddy Rich, the aforementioned, I think I can't think of his name all of a sudden. Losing my mind here. Louis Bellson, Gene Krupa, they were all recorded for Norman Granz. Chico O'Farrell, this is volume 1 of that. Mambo Dance Session, and this is Latino Dance Session, number 27 and 28 here for Norgran. They're actually quite different sounding sessions, to be honest. And then wrapping up the Norgran imprint, you have the great Kenny Drew, one of his first recordings. There might be a Blue Note session before this on from 52, 51, but what a cool DSM cover that is. And very young. He's going to join Miles pretty soon for a number, maybe a year or so. Anita O'Day, who sang with the swing bands. I believe she was with the Dorseys for a while, and I think she was also with, boy, my mind's slipping me right now. But she's a great singer, a great stylist. Another tough to come by 10-inch. Then last but not least, the Afro-Cuban Jazz North of the Border. Again, that's referencing America, not Canada, north of the border. It's coming north from, and that's Jack Costanzo, the great bongo player, who's at the forefront of a lot of great stuff in the Afro-Latin beat sound. Next, we're going to look at Riverside quite quickly. Riverside becomes one of the great labels in jazz by 57. 56 even, they're really starting to make a large impact with guys like Thelonious Monk and Bill Evans. But in 53 they launch. And like Blue Note, they kind of put their feet in the water, recording New Orleans, Dixieland era, swing era guys, just without the modernity of what Norgran was doing. But you have some Armstrong stuff here, number 1001. Johnny Dodds. So it's kind of on par with what some of the Blue Note stuff was happening around that same time. Muggsy Spanier and Tesh, the Chicagoans. This isn't a complete set. I haven't got all these yet. King Oliver, Louis Armstrong, Freddie Keppard, the great New Orleans trumpet players. King Oliver plays the blues. 107, 1007. James P. Johnson, the great Harlem piano player, fantastic player. Art Hodes, the Chicago native. The great Fats Waller. So again, you're getting a lot of these kind of veteran legends getting a second rebirth here. George Brunis, cool cover. Blue Note and Prestige, not so much Prestige, but Riverside. They're giving these guys a second life, and it's kind of leading to a resurgence or some more Armstrong. And the actual date of all these recordings, I'm not clear on. How many of these were actually recorded by Grauer and Keep News, whether some of it was licensed from earlier material. I mean, there's probably a lot of 78 RPM stuff that was out there waiting for someone to repackage on the new format. Jimmy Blythe, a very forgotten piano player from the south side of Chicago. Jimmy Blythe, State Street Blues. So these old Riversides are fun. They don't cost a lot. Red Nichols and Miff Mole. Tommy and James Dorsey. And whenever I stumble on those in record stores, I'll grab them. Now we move on to the 2500 sequence, which was a more modern deviation for Riverside from that 1000 sequence. And this was a short-lived sequence because the LPR is going to dawn quite quickly after this. But here you have the great Randy Weston. And again, this is initially a 10-inch. This is a Japanese 12-inch version of it, though. Great cover with the great New York piano player Randy Weston. Bob Helms, the Riverside Roustabouts, San Francisco clarinet star. And that one's debatable in terms of its modernity. Lou Waters, again, 2500 sequence, but Lou Waters is also a Bay Area throwback player. Don Elliott, Rusty Diedrich, this is much more modern. Don Elliott, we talked about him recently, this from the last episode, last label. And then Barbara Lee is number 2518. Again, this is a modern 80s version, Affinity, I think it was, audiophile, sorry, LP release of what was a 10-inch initially. And they actually add some tracks to this that were recorded in the 70s or 80s to make it a full-length album. So they have the original 10-inch stuff plus the new stuff. And if I remember, they brought most of the original band back together to record the extra tracks. And Billy Taylor is one of the people that really helped put that together. It's really good stuff, and it leads to where Riverside's going soon. So the next great label that arrives on the scene in 1953 is Bethlehem, founded by Gus Wilde with a young Creed Taylor in tow, and they had a guy by Red Clyde who ends up founding Mode Records in the West Coast later, who was their West Coast affiliate and helps record West Coast talent for Bethlehem. And we'll talk about some of that Red Clyde stuff as we get to it here in this discography. But the Bethlehem 10-inch archive from 53, 54, 55 is really outstanding. It's incredible stuff. It's some of the coolest cool bop you'll ever come across. Some of the neatest some really cool East Coast sounding stuff. It's a real mishmash, great Burt Goldblatt covers. As cutting edge and as forward thinking as jazz was in 53, 54 in some ways. And Norman Granz has a slightly more established roster of artists, but Gus Wilde certainly has his ear to the ground with the help of Creed Taylor, with the help of Red Clyde. He's bringing a lot of the great West Coast talent from the Stan Kenton, Woody Herman groups, giving them sessions of their own. They're hearing some of the great East Coast black musicians and capturing some of their sounds. He gives leadership roles to people who had never had leadership roles before. So without further ado, let's take a look at the Bethlehem 10-inch sequence. And this is really the dawning of Bethlehem here. Chris Connor, a great singer, number 1001. Alice Larkins, a great piano player, backs her up here. She was a singer with Stan Kenton for a number of years. And so for Wilde to give her own recordings was kind of a no-brainer in a way. There's the young Nina Simone is a big part of the Bethlehem story, and I don't think she actually gets a 10-inch, but she records some early 45s, and she eventually gets an LP released later on. She was kind of brought in to replace Chris Connor when she left for Atlantic, because Atlantic gave her pretty good money. There's the second Chris Connor record, a great Burt Goldblatt cover there. Oscar Pettiford, one of the most important bass players in modern jazz. For all the Ron Carter fans and Paul Chambers fans out there, Oscar Pettiford is one of the most important bass players. Ray Brown will tell you that. I mean, it's just, the lineage is so direct, and it comes obviously through the great bass player who worked with Ellington in the late 30s, who dies from tuberculosis at a young age, whose name is escaping me. Jimmy Blanton, on the tip of my tongue. Jimmy Blanton was one of the first great innovators of the bass. Takes it up from being just a back boom, 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 just a propulsion instrument, and brings tonality and some leadership ability and some ability to even kind of play melodic intervals and color. And Blanton was such a dynamic player, and Pettiford's certainly the descendant of that, and it leads into all the modern bass players of the Minguses and the Ron Carters and all that generation that was to come later. The great Scott, this guy is a very forgotten player, Bobby Scott, great piano player, cool Goldblatt cover. And again, tell me you don't see the Reed Miles taking from that with the shadows and the block sans serif fonts. It's pretty obvious that Goldblatt's impact is immense. Here's Ruby Braff, the great trumpet player, who has a lot of New Orleans sound in him. I can smell a little bit of mildew on that, but great 10-inch Burt Goldblatt cover. Braff's a fiery player. It's fun finding all these old records. Johnny Guarnieri's on the piano, has some sessions at Savoy. The great Walter Page is on the bass here, along with the drummer Bobby Donaldson. So it's an interesting lineup there for sure. Holiday with Hank. Hank D'Amico is a great clarinetist. Again, a very forgotten face in today's jazz universe. His version on here of Bernie's tune, is just fantastic. It personifies what cool jazz kind of is. Horn of Plenty, the great Charlie Shavers. I'm a huge fan of Charlie Shavers. Just a wonderful player. a jazz narration by Al Jazzbo Collins, who was kind of a personality in jazz at that time. Shavers was truly one of the most forgotten players from this era, and could embody anybody's sound, and played on a lot of important recordings. Aaron Sachs, another clarinetist, a guy that's pretty forgotten again. The compositions of Bobby Scott. Again, a really cool cover there. East Coast Jazz Volume 1. You can see the East Coast has been turned on its side. So, again, you see Goldblatt's graphic design innovations really kind of forebear to what Reed Miles was going to come do, and really changes the face of graphic design in all medium. Vinnie Burke, East Coast Jazz Volume 2. Vinnie Burke was a great bass player. He backs a lot of the great singers. Just a real talent. His trio stuff's really fantastic. Peter the Great. This guy has a session on Verve as well. Fantastic alto player, Pete Brown. Tom Dowd is actually one of the engineers here, who has a fame in Atlantic later. Pete Brown's definitely a forgotten player in today's world. The great Joe Puma, the fantastic guitarist that we talked about again. A lot of strains of the cool in Puma, but again, jazz guitar always has some cool to it. The great Sherman, Eddie Sherman, a fantastic player. He played with Tad Dameron, George Shearing, and Buddy Rich, Lionel Hampton, Charlie Barnett. I just was digging into Eddie Schulman the other day. Eddie Schulman's a fantastic player, and of course Eddie Shue comes from the name Eddie Schulman. You can see his little outline there in the eye of the owl. I mean, that's just cool graphic design Goldblatt's kind of coming up with at this early stage. The great Jonah Jones, who makes some great jazz recordings for Capitol throughout the 50s and 60s that people will remember him for, but they'll forget how great a player Jonah Jones was before that. And again, a really cool Goldblatt cover, the line drawings and the symmetry. He's just a really interesting, innovative designer. Terry Pollard, a fantastic Detroit native. She was a fantastic pianist. She played the vibraphone. In a male-dominated universe, she makes a fairly good impact and shows up in several places. Probably not as much as she would have had she been male, but certainly had the respect of all the musicians in the scene. Sincerely Conti, this is one of those West Coast sessions I was talking about that Red Clyde helped pull Conti from his West Coast big bands. I think he was playing with Herman. It might have been Kenton, I can't remember. Great cover. Just moody. And Conti's a fantastic player. And he ends up in the show bands in the big studios for a long time. Stan Levy, the great drummer out of Philadelphia. Here playing with Bob Cooper and Bob Holman and Jimmy Joffrey. He's playing the compositions of those guys, sorry. Fantastic stuff. Levy's a fantastic player who backs Parker and a lot of other real luminaries in the scene. Herbie Mann, here's his arrival. And Herbie was one of the great flautists of the jazz era. And firmly in the cool in a recording like that. More Oscar Pettiford, basically Duke. You can see the cool color palette there, chosen by Goldblatt. More Charlie Shavers, the intimate Charlie Shavers. And some of the stuff will get repackaged on LP, but some of it doesn't. The great Charlie Mariano, again, a fantastic alto player from the West Coast scene that Red Clyde lines up for a recording here for Bethlehem. Carmen McRae went to having a long career. It was a Decca she recorded for, or Liberty, like one of the big labels she records a lot of vocal records for. Here's some early work by her. What a cool cover that is. I mean, you can really see the modernity of some of these covers, the timelessness. Stu Williamson, Vermont native, if I remember, him along with his brother Claude. Stu was a fantastic trumpet player, full of fire, and he plays some screaming hard bop on the West Coast with the Kenton groups. Just a dynamic player. Here we have Herbie Harper, who's a fantastic trombone player. Please, no more Shaggy Dog stories. I'd much rather listen to Herbie Harper. Interesting name for a session. Herbie was firmly in the West Coast cool camp. Makes a number of great recordings. We'll see some more of his work coming up with the next label, Nocturne. What a cool cover that is. Bob Hardaway. Blues Blue. I cover the waterfront on here is just fantastic. There you have some Army Navy guys sitting in Times Square back in early 50s. It's a promo copy actually. Bob Hardaway's on the tenor. Marty Page is on the piano vibes. Larry Bunker's on the drums. Max Bennett's on the fantastic session work there. Helen Carr. That's a reissue. This is an original copy of that. Helen Carr was a great singer whose LP on Bethlehem was fantastic. This 10-inch is also very worth tracking down. The version of Living on the 99th Floor is just fantastic. Great cover. Really sets the mood. It looks like it's in the, not the Palmolive building, but the Paramount building in New York there. What a great cover that is. Hence, home you idle creatures, get you home and lend an ear to Max Bennett. Max Bennett was an incredible bass player, plays on both coasts. He ends up being a member of the Wrecking Crew, that recording group of artists. He plays bass, electric bass on a lot of great rock and roll records and R&B records. But here he is firmly in jazz, playing with the Williamson Boys and Charlie Mariano. It's a cooking record. That's fan. And Helen Carr actually sings a couple songs in that as well. This is Bobby Scott, another great kind of forgotten player in today's world. Here's Bobby Troop. And Bobby Troop ends up being married to Julie London, and they've starred together, if I remember, on Emergency. I know Julie was on that for sure. I'm not positive but they were. Bobby Troop sang Route 66. So I mean, there's a jazz legacy to a lot of these people. The Australian Jazz Quartet. So jazz made its way all the way to the other side of the world. Here's some more Ruby Braff, a Japanese pressing, arrangements by Bob Wilbur. So you have cool, you have some New Orleans, you have some post-bop, modern, you have some hard bop. Here's Happy Miners by Red Mitchell with Bob Bookmeyer and Zoot Sims. So again, you have some West Coast players. Red Mitchell has a strong, fiery trumpet lineage where he records with Parker. Mitchell is a fantastic. Sorry, Red Mitchell's a bass player, singing Red Roddy. But yeah, fantastic stuff. Here's some more Ruby Braff, Bell at the Ball. And wrapping up the Bethlehem sequence here, Dick Wetmore, who plays trumpet and also some fiddle. Jazz fiddle is always a fun thing to kind of immerse yourself in. Paula Castle, one of my favorite covers from this era. A great singer, melancholic and moody. And so what a fun time jazz was going through here. Joe DeRise, he has an LP on Bethlehem as well, but his 10-inch is also really fantastic. He sits at the piano and sings and plays. A wonderful lyrical style, a beautiful voice, bit Mel Torme-ish, hints of Sinatra. Love Joe DeRise. And then this is Russ Garcia, another one of the fantastic arrangers of the cool era. And he takes some bigger band ensembles and brings some cool and modern swing to some interesting stuff. So what a great little canon of music Bethlehem puts together at that point. So now we're looking at Nocturne, which was a West Coast label founded by one of the members of the Pacific family, Roy Hart, who was a drummer himself, and the great bass player Harry Babison. They formed this Nocturne label. It wasn't long-lived. There was 8 10-inches that came out and they disappeared. And I think it was Liberty that bought the stuff that Nocturne does and reissues it as a jazz sequence. But here's that Herbie Harper, the trombone player we talked about on Bethlehem. So you can see how the jazz universe is very interwoven. Names that we see on one label will pop up on another label. And even though we may not know Herbie Harper, at this time he was a pretty big name, recording for both Bethlehem and Nocturne with the great Bob Gordon. And Bob was a baritone player, Jazz in Hollywood series. Fantastic stuff. Real West Coast cool with a hard swing to it. All these covers are black and white. Here's Jazz in Hollywood with Shorty Rogers, but this is Bud Shank, the alto player. They're playing Shorty Rogers' songs, compositions of. Bud Shank's on this with Harry Babison, Roy Hart's on the drums. Shorty Rogers actually does play on it, flugelhorn. And Jimmy Ralls plays some great piano, and Ralls is a great pianist who backs Billie Holiday and was around for a long time. Jazz in Hollywood series, Bud Shank, number Nocturne, Volume 2. So Volume 3 on Nocturne is Harry Babison himself, quintet, with Larry Bunker, Jimmy Ralls, Bob Evenson on the trombone, and then Roy Hart on the drums. So again, Hart and Babison were the founders of the label. So again, they're trying to kind of establish a label for musicians themselves to record what they wanted to record. And I mean, you see Bethlehem with Red Clyde stepping into that same vacuum, because these guys were all stuck in the Herman groups and the Kenton groups and playing good stuff, but not what they really wanted. They wanted to record what the black guys in the East Coast were doing. And so recording for a label like Nocturne, creating your own little label, having Red Clyde take some of these guys and give them their own sessions for Bethlehem. This was a big deal to a lot of these guys. Conley Graves was a pianist from the West Coast who I don't remember much about. It's been a while since I read the liner notes on this one. If I remember, he passes or disappears from jazz rather quickly, but a pretty cool cover. I need to give that a listen. It's been a long time since I even heard that one. Earl Father Hines, which is, it's a bit of an anomaly he shows up here, because Father Hines, of course, one of the great original innovators of the piano, goes back to this time playing with Armstrong in the 20s and 30s. One of the great leaders of big bands in the 40s and 50s. Earl Father Hines is a very important figure who doesn't really fit in with the rest of what's happening here at Nocturne in terms of his legacy and his place in the jazz universe. Bob Endvoldson, a trombone player, well, again, we saw him on some of those same Bethlehem sessions, because these West Coast guys were all working on each other's stuff. This is the Endvoldson Quintet Jazz in Hollywood series. Let's see if we can see the band here. Howard Roberts on the guitar, the great West Coast guitarist who was also Wrecking Crew member, and has some great recordings for, was it Capitol? I think it was. Don Heath is on the drums, Marty Peisch on the piano, Roy Hart on the bongos, and Harry Babison's on the drums. So those two founding members of this label obviously are going to record a lot of the rhythm sections here. Herbie Harper gets a second title here as a band leader. And the quintet as Bud Shank, Marty Peisch, Harry Babison, Roy Hart, Al Hendrickson on the guitar, Herbie Harper. Fantastic stuff. And then the last but not least, the Virgil Gonzalez Sextet. Virgil was a Bay Area native, I remember, a baritonist, fantastic kind of forgotten player, featuring the Buddy Wise and featuring Lou Levy, the great piano player. Lou Levy does some sessions for Nocturne that don't get issued till later on Liberty. But just great stuff. What a fun little label Nocturne was. And again, that's the end of that run. It was a short run for them. So we're going to split this episode into two parts, because we have some other big labels to cover from this 53, 54, 55 window, and we're already at 43 minutes here. I'm a little disappointed how few people have watched these episodes. I think they're some of the most informative, interesting looks at jazz from this era. It just goes to show how many people just want to have what's trendy, what's cool, and be part of the hip crowd. And boy, we better have that modern reissue of something that's huge that everyone knows about and don't really want to know all the real information that's out there to be had. But I mean, I'm not here to critique people's listening habits. I'm trying to inform those who do want to know more, but I just still put kind of some effort in these episodes, and they haven't really gotten the viewership that if I had put Tone Poet under them, they would have gotten. But I mean, Riverside, Bethlehem, Nocturne, Norgran, these are important parts of the jazz history. This is the important parts of the story. And seeing all this cross-referencing, not only does it validate where I come from and what I have to share, because you can see I can put it all together. It just helps you understand yourself, how little of this stuff has survived to the modern day, how broad the jazz universe was, how much there is to really learn and grasp and listen to, how great most of it is. It's an incredibly big jazz universe that exists still in the early 50s. And it starts narrowing more and more as we get further along in the time. But it's a really fun world to be a jazz fan in 1953. There's a lot of great stuff. All the labels that we've talked about so far, most of them still exist, and all these new ones are showing up on the scene. There's just a lot of great recordings by a lot of black and white musicians. Cool is happening. Bebop still being documented. Hard bop's about to become codified. It's an exciting time. So stay tuned and watch the next episode. And I hope you all enjoy it. Have a great day. Please support the channel if you can. If you want to send money to my Patreon, if you want to support through PayPal, YouTube thanks, all that does help. I'm trying to keep this little jazz cafe going, and money's been tight. Y'all be blessed. Have a great day. Peace. Bye.